This next presentation is really about trying to provide a little bit of local data pardon me, and local flavour to back up some of Chris's comments. And it's really all about pre-emergent herbicides. They're certainly part of the solution, but there's still a lot we have to learn. It's no surprise, and Chris made the point, our entire farming system is very much threatened by weeds. Herbicide-resistant weeds we're seeing in fallow and in crop, and it goes from wild oats, which we're running into problems with probably 10 or 12 years ago, through weeds such as ryegrass and also with Ormond's barnyard grass. At the same time, we're also selecting for more tolerant weed species. And by that I'm meaning weeds such as fleabane and feathertop Rhodes grass, which might not fit in that traditional resistance category, but we've been selecting for it by overuse of some of our herbicides. Quite clearly, we need to increase the usage of other tools. Some of those include the residual herbicides. That's a fairly simple option, but it's not going to get us to the end game in a great shape, perhaps. But we've also got to start looking at a lot of the non-herbicide options in a lot more detail. One of the issues, though, we still have is that with any of the residual chemistry, with these residual herbicides, we have more issues and more variability in terms of crop safety, but we also tend to have more variability with efficacy. So they're not as easy to use as knockdowns, and that's the reason why the industry moved to knockdown herbicides 20 or 30 years ago, because they were much easier to use to get consistent results. Not sure how well that will come up, but that's a photo of a trial that one of our staff conducted in the Malali area last year, and it's certainly a situation where you'd hate to see that on a whole paddock scale. This was a trial looking at some ryegrass products. As you can see, this particular treatment, which was a high rate mixture, gave us very little emergence when you compare it to what happened without any herbicide treatment at all. This is the data that actually came from that site, and in fact there were two different trials established the same day, the same tank of herbicide, because they were adjacent paddocks, and the only major difference being that there were two different planter types used to incorporate the products. We're looking here in terms of wheat emergence as a percentage of the untreated. So you're hoping to hit 100%. The blue columns are the results when it was planted with a tine planter. And as Chris was saying, that's a way of getting a lot of that herbicide out of that planting row. And in that particular case, it was only these higher rate mixtures that were causing a significant reduction in wheat emergence, even though there's a trend to reduced emergence from all those treatments. However, when you look at those yellow columns, exactly the same batch of herbicide, the same tank that was used, sprayed one trial, moved over to the other, sprayed the other site, dramatic levels of damage. And in fact, some of those treatments were getting less than 20% emergence of the wheat. We actually had another treatment in those trials where Boxer-Gold by itself was put on as a post-sowing pre-emergent. Normally with that sort of chemistry, you'd expect that's where you have your highest level of crop effect, because you've got that herbicide in a consistent band right across the top of the planting row. In this case, in fact, we got significantly less damage. And if you have a look at that photo for a moment, I'm not sure how clearly it will come out. Here's the area that our press wheel was working in, and actually our wheat rows were right up on the shoulder of that. So what seems to have been the case in this particular trial is, firstly, we weren't getting a lot of herbicide movement with the single disc anyway, but in fact we were pushing a little bit more of the concentration exactly where the wheat was trying to come through. So we're actually safer in that situation with a PSPE application, rather than an incorporation by sowing method. So that's where the setup of the disc actually has exaggerated or exacerbated the amount of damage that was caused. Just one other slide in terms of some other trial work with disc planters. This is work we've been chasing feathertop Rhodes grass control, a very difficult weed to control with knockdown herbicides, but we do have a range of residual herbicides with good activity, even in crops. This was a situation where we had to target a situation which had bad feathertop Rhodes grass, of course, and in this case, the grower only planted his wheat crops with the disc planter. As you can see, very much the same sort of patterns coming through. We're getting a reduction in emergence across a range of those herbicides. Again, very much the same as Chris showed with trifluralin. You can expect to see some pretty ugly sites, particularly when you're using a disc seeding system. You put up those 3 or 4 slides and the question is, why would we even bother using residual herbicides? That's the weed control data from that site near Malali. It was a situation of essentially alphabet resistance in ryegrass, so Group A's don't work, Group B's don't work, glyphosate doesn't work. You're left with very few options. And in this particular case, whether it's Sakura, coming across the box of gold, we were getting that very high level of weed control with those products. And the same thing is happening with feathertop Rhodes grass and fleabane, as many of you have been putting into practice over the last 4 or 5 years. They're a very useful tool to implement into the system. Key considerations, again, it will follow up on many of the comments from Chris. Depth of planting is certainly very important. Back to that Malali site for a moment, there are actually some guess rows in that situation or in that planting configuration, and although it's not very apparent from that, they were dramatically better in terms of emergence. When we measured the depth of the seedlings there, they were only about 2 or 3 millimetres deeper, but they were much more consistent in depth as well. And although it probably wasn't a huge difference, I think that was part of the reason why we were getting better emergence in those situations. The planter setup, as I showed before, in terms of disc, to be very careful, but tine versus disc, and there is a huge difference. We've seen that before. We did a lot of work with Avidex and trifluralin going back in probably 7 or 8 years ago now. At that stage, my biggest concern about using some of these products with a disc planting system was that we'd lose our weed control or our efficacy. Over the last 18 months, my position has changed quite dramatically. I'm not too concerned about losing the weed control because we've still maintained that in a lot of fallow situations. The biggest risk is clearly from a crop safety point of view. Stubble loads are certainly important, particularly with some of the products like trifluralin. And then finally, rainfall is important, but it's one of those factors we have very little control over, of course. And in fact, at those sites at Malali or the site further north where we got those huge levels of damage, I really don't think rainfall had any great impact. Conclusions. Residual herbicides are certainly an important tool and they have a key role to play, particularly as our herbicide resistance issues continue to increase. However, where we are now, the industry still needs a lot more information. Firstly, on crop safety under a range of conditions, and some of the work that Chris and his team have been doing is starting to fill those gaps. Secondly, how best to manage the opportunities when we're using more residual herbicides in our fallow programs as well. And finally, as we're starting to use these residual herbicides in fallow, but also in crop on some of these target weeds, is there a cumulative effect on crop safety? And are there any other management practices we can start to utilise to reduce those effects, but still get the benefits out of the residual herbicides in terms of weed efficacy? She'll leave it there. in the trial planted with the tine planter in the adjacent paddock, there really was probably only 4 or 5 mils difference in actual placement in depth there as well. So it didn't look like the difference between the tine and the disc was purely because of depth. Now I think the main thing there is we've got the soil throw of the herbicide away from the planting row. But in that disc planted setup, I think we were looking at around 2 centimetres on average where all the damage was occurring. Where those guess rows were about 2.2, 2.3, which doesn't seem a lot of extra depth, but that was probably the main thing we could put it down to in that particular trial.